So we are beginning Mishnah 16, and this Mishnah is a little bit of a change in in terms of who's speaking. Until now, we've had what we call the zugot, the pairs. There were five sets of pairs, finalizing with Hillel and Shammai, where we had said that one of the one of the people was what we call the nasi, the leader, which was more somewhat a political position, even though they were a great sage. And then the other one was the Av Bet Din, the head of the court, and that was the specific role. So one had a more political position than the other, but they shared the leadership. After Hillel and Shammai, that was no longer the case, and now it was one person. And we're going to see that Rabban Gamliel, this is the beginning of the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel was actually the grandson of Hillel. And for the next generations, the leadership was in the family of Hillel. It was descendants. And he was the leader of everything. He was the Nasi, he was the head of the court. So Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, Rabban Gamliel used to say, Aseh lecha Rav, make for yourself a teacher. Here says a rabbi, v'histalek min hasofik, and remove yourself from doubt. V'al tarbel aser amados, and don't give extra tithes due to estimation. Don't do when you're tithing. Don't do estimate. You should be exact. We'll leave that part. We're just a couple of things. First of all, about Rabban Gamliel again. I mentioned he was the grandson of Hillel. So now, in terms of historically, we're talking about 60 years before the Second Temple is destroyed. So this is still during the Second Temple period. His father had been only a short time with the Nasi, I guess, before he had died. And you may have heard Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. It was a following number of generations, and many times in the Talmud for sure they are mentioned. One of the things also we note here is it just as Rabban Gamliel used to say, up until now everyone was receiving the tradition from the previous generation, and now it does not use that phraseology. So there are a couple of different approaches as to why that is the case. One suggestion is that since he was a direct descendant, therefore it didn't need to say it because the son following his father, it's sort of like an automatic, it's like you're taking his place. It's like a new person almost. It's like you are the embodiment of your parent, and therefore didn't need to say it received it. It was like he lives on. That was one approach that by the Tiferes Yisrael. Another approach to explain it is actually that up at this point in history, there became more differences of opinion. And since there were more differences of opinion, it wasn't as obvious to say, oh, this person received the tradition in the same way as previous generations. And therefore, it doesn't use that terminology. Also, it happens to be that later on in the second chapter, the Mishnah is going to go back when it gets to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and it's going to tell us that he received the tradition from Hillel. So it means that the actual official line of tradition is going through him and not necessarily through Rabban Gamliel. So his statement is, Aseh lecha Rav, make for yourself a teacher. Now, this other interesting is we had this before. In Mishnah 6, it already was mentioned by Rabbi Hoshua. So why are we repeating it? So there are different of opinions, again, as to whether or not this is is just the same thing, and he's repeating it because he's connecting it to the doubt. Again, when you read this Mishnah, so it said, make for yourself a teacher and remove yourself from doubt. So most commentaries kind of put that together as one thing, is that by making yourself a teacher, you will remove yourself from doubt. And that's the emphasis here, whereas before that wasn't the emphasis. But according to, for example, Rashi, this is the same. He's already explained it before, what it means to make Yosef. You need a teacher in order to make sure that you're on the right track, and someone who has the tradition. So that's why you need a teacher, and this is the same idea. One idea, again, one of the things about learning on your own sometimes is you are not always sure you're correct. If you learn on your own, you might have doubts. So if you have someone else who's helping you, then that can alleviate your doubts. Another point made is when it comes to halachic decision making, and some of the commentators, like the Rambam, for example, says that this when it's in this Mishnah, it's talking about halachic decision making. That before, when it was talking about make a teacher, have a teacher to teach you Torah just for the sake of learning and for the sake of knowledge. Now we're talking about the sake of practical halachic advice. What do you do in such a situation? Is this kosher? Is this not kosher? Whatever, things like that. And therefore, the Rambam says now you need a rabbi, you need a teacher who you can rely on to say this is okay and this is not okay. And we'll get back to that in a moment. But the way the Rashi is understanding it also is that sometimes if you just make statements on your own, you think you're so confident, but not everything is clear. Right? So what happens when you have many cases which are very not clear as to what the proper approach is, especially when it comes to situations of life and death, et cetera. And even it could be in a regular, the old days you bring the chicken or you bring the cow that was shechted, is it kosher? It's not always so obvious. We're not in that situation because we don't see the cow, but what we see, we just have to look at the label on the package. But back in this first step of the process, somebody's got to be able to say that the shechita was kosher. So, and that the animal was okay. So there actually be some very fine points, and therefore you have to know. So, but let's say you're not clear. So then go ask someone greater than you. Have someone who you can rely on to make those decisions for you. And also another angle is when talking about core beliefs in terms of a hashkafa or outlook. What do we believe? We also need to help. We need help with that in direction as well. Is going back to, I mentioned in the Rambam about relying on someone for decision making in, something's kosher, not kosher. So one of the things about having a rabbi that you've chosen, and we've also mentioned this numerous times in other classes, is that if you can't pick and choose, right? You can't pick and choose. So you have to have someone, that person's gonna be able to tell you this is yes and this is no. And if you're picking and choosing, then they're not making the decision. You're the one who's making the decision, and you're just doing what you want. You're not necessarily doing what is the right thing. And therefore you need someone who you can say that's the approach. When he says it's good, it's good. When he says it's not good, it's not good. That you find a person who is knowledgeable to a degree that you can rely on. Rabbeinu Yonah adds to this, a lot of times it doesn't have to be a teacher, doesn't have to be someone who's above you. And we also had mentioned this when we talked about teacher the first time, because over there it connected it to having a friend. So if you have, let's say you're not sure about something, so you don't have to go to a teacher. You could go to a friend, someone who's equal, even someone who's not as knowledgeable as you can go to them as well, because there's a concept as follows. Now, first of all, we're talking about people who are sincere. Okay, we're not, there's all kinds of people. There are people who don't know anything and will tell you they don't know anything, and therefore they're not going to give you an answer. So those kind of people, usually if they say, look, I know this to be true, you can rely on it, because that most of the time if they don't know, they're going to tell you that. But there are other people who don't know anything and they're not going to ever tell you that. They're always going to act like they know. So if you know that type of person and they don't really have that knowledge base, you can't rely on them. So we're talking about someone who you can rely that if they say that they know it, then they're being very sincere about it and they really most likely do know it. So a person like that, even if not as knowledgeable as you are or not as smart as you are, you can rely on them. And in fact, the Gemara talks about that idea that if you have two people, you have one person who's the great sage, he's so very brilliant, and he's not sure about something, and you have someone who's not as great as that person, but that person is sure, then we are going to rely on the person who is sure. We're not going to say, oh, well, the great sage is in doubt. No, this person we can rely on that. So therefore, Rabbeinu Yonah says that here also you should go and ask. You're not sure, go and ask someone who you can rely on, and if they say yes, you can rely on that. And another important point about decision making is that if sometimes you think, oh, so I'll go one way or the other. Even being, sometimes you can be lenient on something, and then you're causing someone else to make a mistake. You're saying, okay, it's okay to do that. Well, okay to do that, you could cause someone else to sin. On the other hand, if sometimes you say you're going to be too stringent, you can cause a person a loss. Someone comes to you and says, we'll give the old case of the chicken is kosher, right? The person comes to see you, ask you if the chicken is kosher, and if you say yes and you're wrong, well, you just cause them to eat not kosher chicken. On the other hand, if you say it's not kosher and really is, you'll just cost them a loss of money. And if it was a cow, it's a lot more money than a chicken. So you've just cost that person a lot of money. So therefore, someone who's not knowledgeable has to be careful from answering these questions and don't just as we'll be stringent and that's okay. It takes a lot more knowledge and confidence to be able to actually say that something is permitted than to say something is not permitted, right? We know that also. The greatest sages are the ones who have we'll call it the shoulders to be able to say something's permitted, and they also feel the level of responsibility. Yeah, there's actually a lot more to say here, but we'll just point out one more thing about the teacher. And it's an interesting thing that Rabbi Tversky talks about the idea that it's repeated a second time. He says it teaches you about OCD, about obsessive compulsive disorder, that sometimes a person can be overzealous in their attempts to make sure that they did something, right? Someone who's OCD, they go back and they do it again and do it again. So even in performing a mitzvah, you could be overzealous. I'm not sure I did it, or I'm not sure I did it right. And he connects it to the last part of the Mishnah where you're tithing, I'm not sure if I took 10%, I'm not sure if I gave enough, and you can end up giving more. And that could end up actually in halachic problems because you may end up giving, it won't be the 10% that you're supposed to do. It'll end up being something could be viewed as special and sanctified when it's really not. And so therefore you says, get it, you need someone else. You need a person who's a teacher, a Rav, who's going to be able to tell you the halacha, and then you have to be able to trust that person so that you don't have those doubts. You have to be able to overcome your ability to say, well, I'm not sure. You can just put it on the other person's shoulders. You can rely on that other person. And ultimately, each one of us should have someone who we could ask that we could rely on. Okay, we'll have to hold it here. Have a great day, everyone.